Okay.
Welcome to the How Sustainability is Shaping the Printing Industry webinar today, presented by Sarah Rizzo. The program is brought to you by the Charter. This is the Printing Charter, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Green Tier SGP program, the Association for Roll-to-Roll Converters, the Flexographic Technical Association, GLGA, Printing United, and then the Tag and Label Manufacturers Institute. I'm the moderator today. My name is Joe Lyman. I'm president of the Great Lakes Graphics Association. We represent printers throughout the three-state region, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Next slide, please. A little bit about webcast logistics. We mute all attendees that we're able to mute. If you hear any unnecessary background noise, of course, you can always dial in via phone. If you have a question or a comment, use the chat box on the side frame of the software, and questions can always be asked at the end of the program. This webcast is being recorded, and it will be made available to you by email, along with a copy of the slide in the next few days. Next slide, please. At this time, I'd like to ask Gary Jones to talk a little bit about the bridge between Green Tier and the SGP program.
Oh,
Gary?
thanks, Joe. And I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule this afternoon to sit through our webinar. I think you'll find the webinar to be very, very informative, very insightful. We're excited to have Sarah giving the webinar. So let me talk a little bit about Green Tier and the Sustainable Green Printing Partnership. And basically, the way to look at these two programs, they're independent programs, but they're two programs that you want to seriously consider getting engaged in if you want to be able to demonstrate your commitment to sustainability, basically. You can do it by joining the Green Tier program or the SGP program. Ideally, we would encourage you to look at both the programs. The Wisconsin Printing Industry Council, as Joe said, we're a group of associations and the DNR working together on regulatory streamlining and sustainability. But we've worked closely with each other on both of these programs and aligned them so that if you get engaged with one of the programs, it's a lot easier and a really easy lift to get engaged in the other program. So we've worked very hard with the DNR on making sure that the criteria are compatible, and the changes or issues that you would have to address under each of them is pretty easy to do. So if you're seeking local national acknowledgement of your commitment to being a sustainable business, you can look at being certified by SGP, recognized under Green Tier. As I said, we have common evaluation criteria, and it's a lot easier if you're interested. And if you do want to pursue either one of them, you can let me know. As Joe indicated, I'm Gary Jones. I'm with Printing United Alliance. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to Jenny at the Green Tier program, or even Joe at GLGA. We'll make sure that you get your questions answered. And back to you, Joe.
I guess I can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Thank you everybody for being here. As Joe and Gary said, my name is Sarah Osorio. I work at Printing United Alliance as the EHS Affairs Coordinator. We help our members with all kinds of issues relating to sustainability, environmental compliance, and OSHA compliance. Today I'm going to be focusing on sustainability and how sustainability is shaping the printing industry. On our agenda today, I'm gonna talk a little bit about what sustainability is, what the circular economy is, and what environmental social governance, or that acronym that we all know ESG is. I'm gonna talk about the drivers for these three concepts, but I'm gonna focus today mostly on accountability and regulatory accountability. So we're gonna talk a lot about those drivers for accountability. And then finally, I want to touch upon some of the forces that are shaping the future of sustainability, the circular economy, and ESG. But first, let's kind of talk about what sustainability actually is. And the first time that sustainability was sort of defined, or there was like a real definition for it, came out of the 1987 Brundtland Report, also known as Our Common Future. And that very first definition basically said that humanity has the ability to develop sustainably, and it basically has the duty of ensuring that our current generations can meet their needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs as well. So, in simple terms, that says leave the world better than you found it, take no more than you need, and, do no harm. But if you do some harm, if you do take more than you need, then you should try to make amends for that. But there's often a common misconception that sustainability is all about the environment and all about, protecting the environment and all about the planet. But sustainability actually has three very important pillars. And if you don't have all three pillars in your organization, then you can't really call yourself sustainable. And these pillars are people, planet, and profit. So when it comes to people, a good example I like to kind of touch upon is, OSHA compliance, making sure that your employees are safe, that your facility is a safe place to work. That's a part of sustainability. Planet, it's not just about, conserving energy, but then also making sure that you're properly managing your waste. And then, of course, as a business, profit is very important. So your business is not sustainable unless it's actually profitable. And it's not necessarily just profit as in getting more customers. You're getting more customers because of your sustainable, your sustainable practices, but also profit from avoiding fines, avoiding regulatory issues if you're not complying with, like I said, OSHA, EPA, and things like that. Then a very important term that is really getting a lot of momentum right now is known as the circular economy. So I would say that right now we are somewhere between a linear economy and a reuse economy. We do have a lot of raw material input, and we do recycle some materials, but for the most part, there is still a lot of waste. Our recycling systems are not quite where they need to be. And the goal is to get to that circular economy where you have a very low input of raw materials, and those raw materials cycle through the economy over and over and over again. And then finally, ESG. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's basically a method to rate companies, mostly public companies, against a set of these identified criteria. And the problem with ESG is that there's really no single ranking system. There's a lot of different ranking systems in the ESG space. So you can rank really high in one and not as high in the other. So the problem with this, and we're going to talk about a lot of sustainability regulations, is this lack of continuity, this lack of standardization. It's really hard to comply with a lot of these regulations and then some of these things in the ESG because everything is so different. There's no standard. But what are these drivers? What are the main drivers pushing, sustainability, the circular economy, and ESG? Well, I think the first one, and I think the one that everybody is very familiar with, is climate change and by extension pollution. And the push for climate change is this goal to reach net zero by 2050. And that net zero goal by 2050 was put in place by the International Panel on Climate Change. And basically what they've said is that we need to reach net zero by 50 in order for us to avoid reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in our atmospheric temperatures pre-industrial levels. They say that any higher than that, it could be pretty catastrophic. So that climate change, you see a lot of companies nowadays saying net zero by 2050 or 50% reductions by 2030. All those statements and all those commitments are to try to stay within that 1.5 degrees increase. Then we also have consumer awareness and activism. That market push is really strong right now. Net zero, like I just said, is the primary E in that environmental social governance. So right now, we're seeing a lot of those commitments around net zero and emissions reductions. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the next E in ESG is going to be. But for right now, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, that's the real big focus. And then also the plastic pollution problem. There's been, a lot of documentaries where we see the turtle with the straw in his nose, or the jellyfish eating, or the turtle eating a bag because it looks like a jellyfish. The plastic pollution problem is gaining a lot of momentum right now. Right now there's a big treaty negotiations going on. They're unfortunately kind of falling apart, but there are treaty negotiations going on to deal with the plastic pollution problem. There's just a lot of debate onto how to deal with that problem. Do we cap plastic production? Do we not cap plastic production? But plastic pollution and consumer awareness around climate change and plastic pollution are big drivers right now. And the focus of today's talk is going to be laws, regulations, and policy. So I won't talk about them too much, but basically I'm going to touch upon emissions limits, emissions reporting for greenhouse gases. That's what GHG is, greenhouse gases. A lot of EPR regulation or laws popping up across many different states. And then a big topic right now for us that we're seeing is these toxics and chemicals packaging laws that are popping up all around the states as well. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too deeply about every single bullet point here, but I will talk about, the main ones that I think are really coming on strong for the industry. So the first one is going to be, like I said, greenhouse gas emissions limits and reporting. Recently, the SEC and California both passed either a law or a regulation that's going to mandate disclosure on greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll talk about the SEC first. So the SEC recently published a rule, it was earlier this year, that is going to require publicly traded companies to disclose Scope 1 and Scope 2. This rule was significantly scaled back from the original proposed rule because it was supposed to include Scope 3. However, that rule is being challenged in court and it was voluntarily stayed by the SEC. So it's not in effect right now and it's not going to go in effect anytime soon, we don't think, but it is out there. Then California last year in October passed 3 different laws in this greenhouse gas emissions and reduction space. So the first one is SB 253, that's the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. This law is going to apply to all companies that do business or operate in the state of California and have a revenue of $1 billion. What does this mean? For example, Coca-Cola, they're based in Atlanta, but they sell Coke in California, so Coca-Cola is going to have to comply with this rule or this law. And what this law basically says is that these companies that are affected, so they operate in California, they have a revenue of more than $1 billion, they're going to have to report their Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. This, we think, is going to have a little bit more of an effect on printers because the inclusion of Scope 3. So because printing companies are a part of virtually every supply chain, we expect a lot of big customers that are going to have to comply with this law to start asking their print suppliers for greenhouse gas emissions and data on their greenhouse gas emissions so that they're able to comply with the law. So even though it's not affecting printers directly, they're certainly going to be affected indirectly. Then SB 261 is the Greenhouse Gases Climate-Related Financial Risk Act. What this says is that companies, again, operating in California, a little bit of a lower revenue threshold. So this revenue threshold is only $500 million. If you meet these requirements, then you're going to have to disclose climate-related risk and mitigation. So what does that say? You're going to have to tell the state of California, based on our operations, and these are the climate risks that we see. So if you're in Florida, hurricanes. If there's a hurricane in Florida and you have company in Florida, how did that affect your operation? And then what are you doing to mitigate these potential risks? And then finally, AB 1305 is the Voluntary Carbon Market Disclosure Act. And this applies to companies of all sizes. So it does not matter how much of a revenue is. There's no threshold like with the previous 2 that I just mentioned. And again, affects companies doing business in California. So even if you're not based in California, you do business in California, it doesn't matter if you have a revenue of 25 cents a year, you're going to have to comply with this. And this says that any company that is buying carbon offsets or making net zero claims, you're going to have to back those claims up. So if you are selling anything into California and you're saying, we're net zero, or this product is net zero, or we have 50% reductions here, you're going to have to be able to back that up. Next, we have EPR. And with EPR goes a lot of these, not similar to EPR, but before I get into EPR, we're seeing a lot of bans, like arbitrary bans across the states on different things. So plastic bag bans, that's a big one right now. Banning single-use plastics, we're seeing that a lot, and bans on certain type of packaging. And then kind of going into the packaging, I did want to talk about EPR a little bit, and we're seeing a lot of EPR pop up across the states. There's been 5 states that have passed EPR so far. They're Maine, California, Oregon, Colorado, and Minnesota. So Maine and California only include packaging, and California does have a 70% off ramp. So basically, if your product has a 70% recycling rate, then you don't have to comply with the EPR regulations. But then Oregon, Colorado, and Minnesota are both packaging and paper. So even though paper has a very high recycling rate and does not necessarily need to be included in these EPR schemes, it is being included. One caveat for Minnesota is that Minnesota is excluding print publications with a circulation of less than 20,000. So books, magazines, anything like that that has less than 20,000 in circulation, that doesn't have to be included in EPR. Now, carbon black. Carbon black is a big one. We are seeing this, I guess, mainly in the Northeast, but it could really have far-reaching effects because of what they're trying to do. So we are seeing some laws pop up either on their own or embedded in an EPR bill that are banning quote unquote toxic chemicals. And one of the toxic chemicals that they're trying to ban is carbon black. Carbon black is the primary pigment in black printing ink, and it's also used as an extender in many other inks. So essentially, what the state of New York and New Jersey and I guess Vermont tried to do is pretty much ban black printing ink on packaging. We jumped into this pretty strongly. It took up most of our summer this year, specifically in New York, and we had a pretty big win. We were able to defeat the legislation. A version of the legislation did pass the New York Senate, but fortunately, the version that passed removed carbon black because our pushback on that was so strong, and thankfully it was heard. Right now, there is an active law in New Jersey, and we are fighting that, but we are hoping that doesn't really go anywhere. Beyond carbon black, we have PFAS and PFOS. I know everybody has probably heard the term. So PFAS has been banned in at least 22 states that from being deliberately added into a product. But beyond that, nationally, EPA did designate PFAS as chemicals of special concern. And what that did is that it removed the de minimis exemption for PFAS. So what that basically did is the de minimis exemption allowed facilities to pretty much ignore the content of PFAS in a product if it was at a very, very low threshold. I believe it's 1% and 0.1% if it's a carcinogen. So even though PFAS are in a lot of products, there really weren't that many PFAS reports to the EPA because they weren't chemicals of special concern. Now that they are chemicals of special concern and that de minimis exemption is removed, we expect there to be there's going to be a lot more reports. So the first report for that is actually going to be due January 1st, 2025 with 2024 data. PFAS are very common in inks. That's what we're finding. They are used as a slip agent in inks. So anybody on this call, I would recommend you double check with your suppliers, ask them for updated SDSs because you want to make sure that these products are not in your raw materials that then you're going to have to report on. And what also comes with the de minimis exemption or the removal of that de minimis exemption is that reporting is also going to be a little bit harder. So you no longer are able to report in ranges. You have to report exact amounts of PFAS, and you are required to use the Form R instead of the Form A, which is a little bit simpler. So again, highly recommend making sure that there are no PFAS in your products. The French mineral oil ban, that's about to go into effect. So France banned the use of mineral oils, which is essentially going to eliminate heat set web printing in France. And we're tracking that, but we've been trying to track that, but there's not much that can be done there, we don't think. And then inadvertent PCBs or IPCBs in certain pigments. So this was a big thing in the state of Washington last year. So the state of Washington introduced legislation in January 2023 that would, hold on. They introduced legislation that would essentially ban chlorinated pigments in the state of Washington. And we jumped on this. We were able to defeat the legislation, and now we're hearing talks that the legislation might come back, that it might be scaled down. Instead of banning all chlorinated pigments, which make up a majority of pigments used in printing inks, it's only going to focus on certain pigments. And we believe that this is being based kind of arbitrarily on a press test that they're trying to run that we highly disagree with. So this is something that we are definitely keeping our eye on. With state stands and regulations, that's very common in the US. Things usually kind of pop up in a state-by-state basis. California Proposition 65, we are seeing, well, California and the Prop 65 program, they are trying to amend their short form warning. So right now, any product, a lot of products, you look at the packaging and sometimes they have that warning sign, it's toxic per California Prop 65. But the short form warning doesn't really require companies to list a specific chemical. However, they are trying to amend that because of the bounty hunters, and people are over labeling and putting a toxic a California Prop 65 label on everything just to cover themselves. Because basically there's these bounty hunters that will go test products and will purposely try to sue companies because of the Prop 65. So in order to avoid this over labeling with Prop 65, what California wants to do is to force companies in the short form warning to also include a full name of the chemical that is toxic under Prop 65. We are fighting hard to oppose this because we don't think that this is the way to this isn't going to take care of the bounty hunter regulation or the bounty hunter issue that is going on. So we don't really agree with that right now. And then in the EU, there's a lot of action in the EU. So the first one is the EU Deforestation Regulation, or EUDR. Under this regulation, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. There's 6 commodities. So we have it's cattle, wood, cocoa, coffee, rubber, and there's 2 more. But the big one there is wood. So basically, any of these commodities and their derivatives, you are going to have to do an extremely detailed due diligence report on these products. And especially if they come from these countries of special concern, so countries that suffer from large rates of deforestation, the due diligence is going to be a lot more specific. Something that is very controversial with this specific regulation is the need to specifically pinpoint what plot of land that the product came from. CSRD reporting. CSRD is it's basically going to be reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, and very similar to what I talked about with California and the SEC, based on risk mitigation, greenhouse gas emissions, risks, that kind of stuff. And then the digital product passport, that is coming up in the next few years, where basically all products in the EU, or they're going to start with a few and then scale it up, they're going to have this this digital passport. So it can either be a QR code, an RFID, anything that the consumer can scan, and it'll give them all of the environmental properties of that product. So where the raw materials sourced, what are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with this product, all that kind of information. And a big topic of conversation right now is greenwashing. And I think the one thing I would love for anybody on this call to take away from this is, if you're going to make any environmental claims, please make sure that you are able to back them up, and you are able to, they're credible claims, because there are a lot of lawsuits coming up, and I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. But before I talk about the lawsuits, I'm going to kind of talk about what you can do to avoid getting sued. So there are a lot of guidances out there that can help you with this. So the Federal Trade Commission Green Guides, highly recommend them. They're legally binding in some states, not in others, but the FTC has enforced their guidelines on numerous times and numerous occasions. They are currently under revision. They were last revised in 2012, and the FTC right now is really trying to define the terms sustainable and recyclable, because a lot of these lawsuits, which like I said, I'm going to talk about, they really deal with what does recyclable or what does that actually mean. And then the White House just released earlier this year a guidance document which has 7 basic principles to rebuild trust and reliability in the carbon offset, carbon credit space. So the problem with carbon offsets right now is they are very hard to quantify and very hard to prove. There have been a lot of baseless carbon offsets claims, and I think Delta got sued recently. I believe that got thrown out, or it might still be ongoing, but Delta got sued for calling a lot of their trips or their flights for consumers carbon neutral, when in reality it was based on a bunch of baseless offsets. And similarly for the carbon offset integrity, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission also recently came out with a guidance on how to, bring back credibility to carbon offsets and how can they actually contribute to meaningful emissions reductions. So the lawsuits, there's been a lot. These are just some new, like very recent ones that I wanted to point out. So first off, as of June 2024, there are 2,666 open climate litigation cases worldwide. Of those 2,666, 233 were filed in 2023. And over half of those, 129, were filed only here in the US. And so in July of 2024, Lululemon was faced with a class action lawsuit alleging that the company's Be Planet campaign was misleading consumers. So the lawsuit basically states that the company is actually doing more bad than good, because even though they have this Be Planet campaign, they actually, I think, doubled their greenhouse gas emissions after they launched Be Planet. In September 2024, the SEC charged Keurig Dr. Pepper for the recyclability claims on their K-Cups. So basically, even though Keurig and Dr. Pepper were told by numerous more facilities that they would not be able to accept their K-Cups, they still labeled them as recyclable. The SEC, like I said, came after them, but there was also a class action lawsuit that they settled on this. So they faced pushback on this from a couple different places. So the company agreed to a cease and desist, and they're going to pay a $1.5 million penalty. And like I said, they faced a previous $10 million class action lawsuit settlement. And they now have to put on their boxes, they can't say these are recyclable. They have to say recyclable only in certain communities. So consumers know they have to check if they can be recycled where they live. And then finally, in October 2024, LA County sued Pepsi and Coke for claiming that the companies lied to consumers about the effectiveness of plastic recycling. And this is just the latest in a very, very long series of lawsuits being brought by the state of California against petrochemical companies and plastic manufacturers for, allegedly deceiving consumers on the effectiveness of plastic recycling. There was also, like I said, Delta was being sued based on their carbon neutral claims. And a big one as well was that Connecticut and Minnesota attorney generals, they sued Reynolds Consumer Products because they were marketing their Hefty bags as recyclable when they're not recyclable, or they can be recycled, but they're not necessarily accepted at all material recovery facility or MRFs. And they had to settle a $4 million class action lawsuit over that. And the whole thing with the term recyclable is that, a plastic can technically be recyclable, but if the material recovery facility does not accept it, then is it really recyclable? And then, like I said, that's kind of what the FTC is really trying to figure out is what is actually recyclable. Does it matter? Is it because the plastic is recyclable? Is it because it can be accepted? There's a lot of nuance to that. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the future focus of sustainability. So like I said, right now the big focus is on greenhouse gas emissions and net zero, but there is a push for going beyond net zero. When we get to net zero, okay, what's next? I'm going to talk a little bit about Scope 3 and Scope 4 greenhouse gas emissions. And then I think the next E in ESG, I said I was going to talk about that. And I think that's going to be biodiversity. So beyond net zero. So right now we are right here at this current state where, at this current state where we are essentially taking more than we need. We are expending resources way too quickly. We are emitting too many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. What we're trying to get right now is that net zero goal. So that net zero doesn't necessarily mean we're emitting zero greenhouse gas emissions or we're using zero resources, but we are emitting as many greenhouse gas emissions or as the carbon sinks on our planet are able to remove them. But beyond moving from there, from that kind of equilibrium, we want to get to that regenerative state where we're going beyond net zero and we're regenerating ecosystems, we're restoring that balance, and we are actually doing more for the planet than the planet, I guess, is doing for us. Scope 3 and Scope 4. So Scope 3 are indirect emissions that occur across the value chain, both upstream and downstream. That's why I said those California laws might really affect printers, because it includes Scope 3. It includes those emissions outside of the company's control, and that includes the supply chain, which is where printers are. And also the thing with Scope 3 is that Scope 3 is most likely than not going to be the largest portion of the carbon footprint for all companies. So this includes things like purchased goods, transportation, disposal. That Scope 3 is really, really going to be the biggest part of greenhouse gas emissions for the majority of companies. And then Scope 4, which is relatively new, and we barely have a handle on 1, 2, and 3, and now there's a Scope 4. So Scope 4 is used to describe avoided emissions, and those are basically reductions that occur outside of the product's life cycle, but they occur because of how the product is used. So using low temperature detergents, using fuel saving tires, energy efficient ball bearings. These are all Scope 4 emissions because they occur out of how you use the actual product, not making the product. And then biodiversity. Biodiversity is really heating up right now. I think it's the big push behind that EUDR, which is where I was saying that companies are going to have to pinpoint the exact plot of land. And I think this is a great quote that kind of explains where we're at with biodiversity. So not just Wall Street, but in general, we've been pricing natural assets at zero for the last 150 years. It's just something that the planet provides. But when you price something at zero, it's a commodity and it's plentiful. But most of the resources that we use are not plentiful. They're very finite. They are finite resources. So they're starting to run out and they're starting to get expensive. And that's a realization that we are all coming to at this point. So we're really having to value these ecosystem services and these resources as more than just something that nature does or something more than the planet does. They are actually very important for the survival of humanity, and we need to start pricing that as such. And then finally, the current state of sustainability. Sustainability is something that I'm very passionate about, and I always feel when I give this presentation, I feel like I'm scaring people away from it and making it seem like it's this big scary monster, but it's not. And it really is something that should be embraced with an open mind. Sustainability is here to stay, first off. It's no longer market driven. It's no longer a nice thing to do. It's no longer something that you want to do because your customers are asking for it. It's not regulatory. It is really quickly moving into the regulatory space, and it's only going to get stronger. Sustainability business plans are becoming a necessity. It's not just about having this kind of unorganized patchwork of sustainable practices or sustainability initiatives. Having an actual plan and something that builds on itself little by little is really, really going to be crucial for the success of any sustainability initiative. Sustainability is demanding greater accountability. And like I said, if there's one thing that I want you to take from this presentation is that accountability and transparency are very important. People, unfortunately, we live in a world, and especially in the US, where we love litigation. We love our lawsuits, and people are looking for that. They really are. So it's very important to make sure that your messaging really, really aligns with what you're actually doing. Sustainability claims need to be carefully considered, develop supporting documentation. And then finally, the most important one here is that sustainability is not a threat. Like I said, it's a journey with many opportunities. It is not here to destroy your business or hurt your business. It is here to help you transition into that next step or next level for your business. And with that, I'll take any questions.
I apologize. Sarah, can you hear me?
Yes.
So we do have a question in the chat, and actually this is something that's been happening across the United States, and that's the emergence of carbon black. That would be the pigment that becomes inert once it is cured in the process of printing. But a lot of states now are swayed. I guess legislators are swayed under the persuasive information that's being provided by a few, what I would call kind of, I don't know if I call them bad actors, but definitely actors that have a motive. So how does sustainability fit into, this issue of carbon black, and even more so, what can we do to be able to address that issue?
Yeah, so let me give a little more context onto the carbon black, because I know I kind of went over it quickly. So we're seeing a couple of reasons why we think that carbon black is trying to be banned. And I think the main two are, number one, these toxicity claims, which I will explain, and then the fact that black plastic is notoriously hard to recycle. So with the toxicity, carbon black powder is toxic, but not because the powder is toxic, but because it enters along in the lungs and it can be toxic. However, carbon black in a matrix such as rubber, such as ink, any kind of matrix where the powder is encapsulated, there are no toxicity concerns whatsoever. We have a letter from OSHA stating this. California Prop 65 states this. The International Association for Research on Cancer, IARC, they say this. As long and in these exact words, as long as carbon black is encapsulated in a matrix, it is not toxic. Then on the black plastic side, carbon black is the main pigment for black plastic. And like I said, black plastic has been notoriously difficult to recycle. However, it is difficult to recycle because our recycling infrastructure is outdated, not because it can't be identified. So what happens with carbon black is that the near infrared radiation waves that are used to store plastics are not reading the plastic, they're confusing it with the conveyor belt. But that NIR technology is extremely, extremely old, and there is great new technology that can sort black plastic and these so-called non-detectable pigments. Now, I did see here in the question, it's asking for innovation with carbon black alternatives such as wood waste and algae. So when we were doing our carbon black research to kind of fight this, we found a company that was essentially making a carbon black pigment with algae. However, that is still carbon black. So even if they can say that, maybe it's quote unquote more sustainably sourced because it's not coming from, oil or petrochemicals, it's still carbon black. So even if it was wood or waste algae, it doesn't matter where the carbon black is coming from, it would still be banned under New York's regulation.
Excellent. Are there any other questions? Well, excellent. Sarah, I can't thank you enough for the information. Obviously, sustainability is something that's pretty impactful here. Oh, Gary has a question. Do you see the focus on sustainability going away, staying the same, or increasing, and why? I saw one of your slides that addressed that, but could you talk a little bit about what you see as the future of sustainability?
Definitely, yeah. So I think sustainability is not going away, and I think it's only going to get stronger. Now, I will say we are seeing a change in administration that obviously we don't expect to see a ton of environmental rules coming out or a huge push for this kind of issue, but it's still, even though I said it's not mostly market driven, it's still very much market driven. And when we're talking about the newer generations, Gen Z, I think in the printing industry, one thing that I heard a lot about recently when I was at the Digital Packaging Summit, for example, is how tough it is for companies to find and retain talent. Well, studies have shown that companies with sustainability or sustainable practices or sustainability plans are better able to retain and attract talent because that is what young people are looking for. So I think sustainability it's very much regulatory driven, but there's a lot of other reasons why I think it's important to focus on sustainability and to realize that it's definitely not going away and it's getting stronger. And it really is because that push also from Gen Z, they're not just taking things at face value. That's why I say that accountability is very important. Not just because you don't want to get sued, but because consumers now are not just seeing a green claim on a packaging and saying, oh, this is perfect. No, they're going to look it up. They're going to research it. They're going to make sure that the decisions that they're making are truly in line with what they care about and they believe in. So I absolutely believe that sustainability is here to stay, for not for the foreseeable future, I think forever. All right, see, another question says, keeping track of all these moving pieces is the hardest part of compliance and innovation. Can you recommend a single authoritative source for printers? So I can't say that I would recommend a single authoritative source. However, I will say, for example, with Green Tier and with SGP, one of the biggest chunks of your certification is going to be regulatory compliance. So I think really looking into that third party certification and those criteria for those third party certifications that kind of break everything down it would be a really good place to start. Let's see. Okay. How can smaller printing businesses with limited resources effectively prioritize sustainability initiatives? So I think the most important thing with small and printing businesses, and I will say this from my current experience from working with a small printer here in Florida for a master's thesis that I've been doing, start with regulatory compliance. Before you start looking at greenhouse gas emissions reductions and you start looking at all these sustainability initiatives, make sure that your basic regulatory compliance is set. Make sure that you're fully OSHA sustainable. Make sure that you're fully sustainable with EPA, hazardous waste. If you're emitting, VOCs and HAPs, making sure that you have that baseline and then working from there. I also think one of the most powerful things that you can do for sustainability in your business is not simply putting this all on one person, but having some sort of sustainability committee or sustainability group within your company from people from all different types or from all different departments so that everybody has input, everybody has valuable input to say. So I think that forming a sustainability committee and asking your employees, where do you think it would be easiest to start? Where do you think we could implement certain practices? I would really, really recommend hearing from your people because they know, they know the ins and outs of the everyday process, and they can really tell you, hey, here's where we could be doing better. What role? I think we have time for one more. So, what role do customers and market demands play in shaping sustainability practices in the printing industry? So, like I said, customers, especially larger customers, I would really, really expect them to start asking you for sustainability data, for greenhouse gas emissions data. Like I said, they're setting targets and they're going to need their value chain to, I guess, step up for them to meet these targets. Because of the inclusion of supply chain, now it's not just going to be market driven. Because of the inclusion of scope 3, like I said, be prepared to be getting these questions. What are your greenhouse gas emissions? What are your specific greenhouse gas emissions when you print for me? So super, super important to not just listen to what your customers are asking for, but in a way kind of read the tea leaves and estimate or guess what they're going to be asking for, because those requests and those questions are definitely coming. All right, I think we're at 2:45, so I think that's all the time that we have. Joe, is there anything else?
No, I appreciate Sarah, you presenting, of course, everybody that registered for the program. We will be sending out an email with the link and the slides here in the next few days. Probably won't be until Friday, but until then, if you have any questions, please reach out to Sarah, Gary, or myself. We'd be more than happy to help you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.